I said that identity theory would be the opposite end of the spectrum from substance dualism. Here again, substance dualism, as we've seen, is the view that the mind and brain are distinct. Well, let me back up. Dualism is the view that mind and brain are distinct, and we've talked about a couple different versions of dualism, substance dualism and epiphenomenalism. On the substance dualist view, the mind, as we saw Foster say, is radically non-physical. So the mind is a spiritual substance, an independent substance from material substance. So that would be one end of the spectrum. And then the opposite end of the spectrum would be to just say that mental states and brain states just are the same thing, or just more generally, let's just say that the mind and brain just are the same thing. That would be identity theory. Let's start with a broad kind of metaphysical term, or term from philosophy of mind, materialism or physicalism. Those two sometimes used interchangeably, would be a broad kind of metaphysical claim according to which the mind is reducible to material states or to physical states. So any physicalist theory of mind would be a claim according to which mental states just are physical states. What is meant by this term reducible is that everything to be explained in our concept of a mental state, or more generally, everything to be explained in our, with respect to our concept of mind, can be explained by some lower level or more basic state of affairs. In the case of mind-brain identity theory, that version of physicalism would be to say that everything that happens in the mind can be reduced to what happens in the brain. Brain processes, sequences of neural activity in the brain, however you want to put it, everything that there is to understand about the mind can be reduced to explanations given in terms of brain states, or brain events, or brain processes. So reduction is a common method of explanation in the history of the physical sciences. Over time, eventually water was reduced to H2O, say for example. Water and H2O are the same thing, of course, but what it means to say that the one thing is reduced to the other is that everything about the one concept can be explained by some more basic concept. So people had a concept of water for a long time before people knew anything about molecular structure, or before anyone knew anything about hydrogen or oxygen. People had a concept of water. People understood that water was wet, that it is typically colorless and odorless. All the kinds of properties that we associate with our perceptual interaction with water at the macrophysical level. Reduction means that all of those properties can be explained by some more basic, lower level state of affairs, namely the microphysical structure of the substance, or in this case the molecular structure of the substance. So water and H2O are the same thing. They are identical. Water is H2O. That's an identity. Reduction means that the thing understood at one level, maybe at the macrophysical level, can be explained by some lower level structure, some microphysical structure. So lightning, for example, was eventually reduced to electricity. People had a concept of lightning for a long, long time. People were aware of lightning for a long time before they had a concept of electricity. But of course it was eventually shown that lightning is electricity. And another way to put the same point would be to say that lightning was reduced to electricity. Everything that happens in lightning can be explained by activities of electricity of a certain kind. So they're the same thing. To say that one is reduced to the other just means that the higher level concept is eventually explained completely by some lower level concept of the same thing. Okay, so that's what would be meant by reduction here. It's a characteristic of scientific progress. That has been the way that so much of scientific progress has been achieved, by reducing some higher level concept to some lower level concept and showing that they are just different ways of conceiving what is actually just the same thing. Water was eventually reduced to H2O, shown to be identical to H2O. Lightning was eventually reduced to electricity, just shown to be the same thing as electricity. And identity theory says that the same thing will happen with respect to the relation between brain states and mental states as brain science, as neurophysiology of the brain advances. So that's what we find Smart arguing in our selections from J.J.C. Smart. He argues that as cognitive science, as neurophysiology of the brain advance, eventually the mind will just be shown to be the same thing as the brain. Mental states will be shown to be the same thing as brain processes. So early on in our selections, Smart says, in so many words, that there isn't anything that is irreducibly psychical. So what would it mean for something to be irreducibly psychical? Here again, to say that it's a psychological state cannot be reduced to some brain state would be to say that here again, even after brain science discovers everything that there is to know about what goes on in the brain, there would still be something left unexplained about this or that mental state. So Smart gives the example of having an after image. He gives the example of having a yellowish-orange after image. The critic of identity theory, somebody coming at this from a different perspective, certainly a kind of dualist, say, for example, would say we could know everything that there is to know about what's going on in the brain and still not know that the person is experiencing a yellowish-orange after image. For one thing, the brain state is not going to be yellowish-orange. And no matter how detailed an understanding we get of the correlations between what is going on at the level of neurophysiology of the brain on the one hand and the correlated mental state that the person is in on the other hand, no matter how detailed a picture that we get of what's going on in the brain, we'll never be able to identify any particular configuration of neurons or any particular sequence of firing at the neural firings at the neural level. We will never be able to identify them with any brain state. There will still be, with any mental state. There will still be, after everything that there is to know about the brain is known, there will still be something that is left unexplained. So Smart says, the suggestion I wish to avoid is that to say I have a yellowish-orange afterimage is to report something irreducibly psychical. So no matter how much we come to know about what is going on in the brain when somebody is having such an afterimage, there will still be more to the content of that mental state, left unexplained by what happens in terms of brain processes. The one will never be completely reduced to the other. That's what the critic of identity theory would say. That's what any dualist would say, and we'll touch on other views as well. No mental state can just be identified with any brain state, is what the critic would say. Here we find Smart saying the opposite. I reject that. I reject that there's any mental state that will prove irreducibly psychical. So again, his view is that every psychological state will eventually be reduced to a physical state. He denies that there's anything mental that is irreducibly psychical, anything mental that is irreducibly mental or irreducibly psychical. Everything psychical, that is to say, everything psychological, everything mental, can in principle be, and perhaps will be, reduced to some physical state of affairs, some physical set of facts, namely what is a set of facts about what is going on in the brain. In our selections, Smart asks, why do I wish to resist this suggestion? That is to say, the suggestion that some mental states cannot be reduced to brain states. Why do I wish to resist this suggestion? Mainly because of Occam's razor. So the old idea of the simplicity criterion that we've talked about in other contexts, the parsimony principle, economy of theory, simplicity criterion, Occam's razor, call it what you will. The simpler theory is more likely to be correct. And identity theory does do well by the simplicity criterion, doesn't it? It does do well by Occam's razor. There are not two things, namely mental states and brain states. They just are the same thing. We must identify them. So there's really just one thing. Mental states are brain states. They just are the same thing. So there's only one thing. So identity theory does do well by Occam's razor. It does do well by the simplicity criterion. It's also the case that now there's no problem of explaining. Let's just contrast the view here again for a moment with the view at the opposite end of the spectrum, substance dualism. We've seen that a problem for that view is to explain interactionism, to explain how something immaterial could interact with something material and vice versa. Well, an advantage of identity theory is that the identity theorist does not have that problem. There's no interaction to explain because they just are the same thing. Mental states just are brain states. The mind just is the same thing as the brain. So there's no problem of interaction to explain. And so this is another respect in which it can be said to be a simpler theory. So it does do well by Occam's razor. It does do well by the simplicity criterion. Here again, as I've said before, Occam's razor is not decisive. No, there are many criteria by which we assess theories, many criteria by which we evaluate theories. No one of them is decisive. That's why I said a moment ago, everything else being equal, the simpler theory is more likely to be correct. But it's not always the case that everything else is equal. Sometimes the more complicated theory actually has more explanatory power. So for the moment, we'll just note that the theory does well by Occam's razor, but we also want to note that that consideration is not decisive. Smart says, it seems to me that science is increasingly giving us a viewpoint whereby organisms are able to be seen as physicochemical mechanisms. So this is an old idea in the history of philosophy and science. It goes back to at least the scientific revolution, what is sometimes called the mechanistic worldview. You think back to the 17th century, 16th and 17th centuries. You think to the scientific revolution, all of the breakthroughs in what was called mechanics at the time, what we would call physics today. But so many of Galileo's breakthroughs in mechanics and dynamics and what we would call physics today had the consequence of showing that the universe is in many respects like a machine. There are certain causal laws about the interaction of bodies such that when you know all of the facts about the interaction, you'll be able to predict what will happen. So take, for example, one billiard ball being displaced by another using the kinds of discoveries in dynamics and mechanics that came out of the scientific revolution. If you know the mass and velocity of the two billiard balls, you can predict what the displacement of billiard ball B will be when it's struck by billiard ball A, say, for example. And it was a consequence of the scientific revolution that so much of the physical world seemed to be governed by the kinds of causal laws that the scientific revolutionaries discovered. Newton's laws of motion, the universal law of gravitation, all of Galileo's discoveries in dynamics and mechanics like the law of falling bodies, the parallelogram law. Think of all the advances in chemistry, Boyle's law for the inverse relation between pressure and volume in a gas. As science has advanced and more causal laws have been discovered that enable you to determine what the state of a body will be once you're given this set of initial facts about it, more and more the universe has come to seem like a kind of machine, and everything that happens in it, from the point of view of physics anyway, everything that happens in the universe can be explained on the model, can be explained on the paradigm of the way that you would explain how a machine does something. So that's an old idea in history and philosophy. It goes back at least to the scientific revolution. And Smart here is adopting that kind of a view, what is sometimes called the mechanistic view. Now, of course, we are part of the physical world, at least the physical side of our existence. The physical dimension of our existence is, of course, a part of the physical world. And if everything that happens in the physical world can be explained on the paradigm of the kind of explanation that we would give for how things happen in a machine, how a machine works the way that it does, then presumably that, or at least prima facie, at first glance, it would seem that that form of explanation would work for everything that happens in us, or at least here again happens with respect to the physical side of our existence. Now, our brain, of course, is also a part of the physical world. So if this mechanistic explanation, if this mechanistic model of explanation, I should say, goes for the brain as well, then everything that happens in a brain, here again, is determined by strictly mechanical processes. At the level of biochemistry, of course, at the level of physicochemical changes, as Smart calls it here, or what we would call at the level of biochemistry of the brain, which of course is would be a very specific kind of mechanistic explanation. It would be different from the kinds of explanations that you would give for the interactions among billiard balls, something like that. We're talking about a much lower level of analysis, but in principle, everything that happens in terms of biochemistry, it seems like here again in principle, could eventually be explained in terms of physics at the lowest levels of analysis, molecular and particle analysis and atomic analysis. So if Smart is right that the mind is just the same thing as the brain, then everything that happens in the mind is mechanistic. Everything that happens in the mind can in principle be explained the same way that we would explain anything that happens in a machine, just explain it in terms of how the parts interact, how the parts of the brain interact at the level of biochemistry, at the level of the firing of neurons and so forth. Will suffice to explain everything that happens in the mind. That is what Smart is saying in adopting this mechanistic view. It seems to me that science is increasingly giving us a viewpoint whereby organisms are able to be seen as physicochemical mechanisms. It seems that even the behavior of man himself will one day be explicable in mechanistic terms. So Smart is certainly not the first philosopher to have had this view. As I said, a mechanistic picture of the universe is a legacy of the scientific revolution. And of course, the scientific revolution was a period of so many breakthroughs in terms of the advance of human knowledge that those revolutions in mechanics and dynamics, what we would call physics today, you think of Kepler and Galileo, Newton, the scientific revolution had great prestige for intellectuals generally because there was such a rapid, such an astonishing sequence of breakthroughs that in a relatively short time overturned so much of the traditional world picture, right? So the scientific revolutionaries in early modern philosophy had a lot of prestige, and that really became, for many philosophers, the model of how to do philosophy. So it's an old idea in philosophy. Take science as the paradigm. Take the mechanistic universe, the mechanistic picture of the universe that comes out of the scientific revolution as the paradigm for explaining everything about human beings. That's an old idea in philosophy. It goes back to the 16th and 17th centuries at least. And Smart is saying in so many words that, in relatively recent times, when our knowledge of the brain and correlations between brain processes and mental states has advanced so much, that is just a later development of what began in the scientific revolution. So even the behavior of human beings will one day be explicable in mechanistic terms. Everything that happens in terms of your behavior will be explained on the same paradigm of explanation, on the same model of explanation that you would use to explain what happens in a machine. That is Smart's view. That's the mechanistic view. That is the view of proponents of identity theory. So it isn't enough, according to Smart, to say that mental states and brain processes are correlated. Of course, a dualist could agree with that. Here again, we've seen that the substance dualist believes that causation is two-way. Everything that happens, well, not everything, but brain processes can cause mental states on the substance dualist view. We've seen the dualist has no problem with saying that. And of course, the epiphenomenalist says that as well, says that brain processes cause mental states. So in both those versions of dualism, dualists would agree that brain processes cause mental processes, or brain processes cause mental states. But Smart is saying it's not enough to say that one thing causes the other. Simplicity requires that we simply say they are the same thing. Simplicity requires that we say they are simply the same thing. Simplicity requires that we identify them. Say every mental state is identical with some brain state. And that's, metaphysically speaking, very different, right? To say that two things are the same thing. X and Y are actually different modes of presentation of just the same thing. And something like the way that water and H2O are just different descriptions, different terms for the same thing. Lightning and electricity are different descriptions of the same thing. And something like the way that Clark Kent and Superman are descriptions of the same entity, right? Just what in philosophy are sometimes called different modes of presentation of what is actually just one thing. By hypothesis, maybe the two different descriptions refer to two different things. But in point of fact, they're actually just different descriptions of the same thing. That is what is meant by identity. In speaking here of identity theory, we're saying that X and Y just are the very same thing. X and Y are just different modes of presentation, different descriptions of what is actually the same thing. Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens. So Mark Twain was the pen name, the pseudonym of the American author Samuel Clemens. Those are just different presentations of the same person, just different modes of presentation, just different descriptions of the same person. Sir Walter Scott and the author of Waverley, different descriptions of the same person, same entity. Water is H2O, lightning is electricity, Clark Kent is Superman, Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens, Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley. In all those cases, the is the is of identity. When we say X is Y, sometimes we're saying they just are the very same thing. That is what is meant by identity here in identity theory. Smart is saying that mental states just are the same thing as brain states. Here again, in something like the way that water is the same thing as H2O. The higher level concept, everything about it can be explained by the lower level concept, but they're just different modes of presentation of the same thing. So, why has identity theory seemed plausible? Well, a prima facie reason for the plausibility of it is that, here again, as I said at the outset of this unit, there are systematic correlations between neural processes on the one hand and mental states on the other hand. How should we explain these systematic correlations? Well, if they just were the same thing, that would explain it. That accounts for the prima facie reason for the prima facie plausibility of identity theory. If they just were the same thing, that would explain the correlation. Every time you meet Samuel Clemens, you're also meeting Mark Twain. Every time you meet Clark Kent, you're also meeting Superman. Every time you're drinking water, you're drinking H2O. That correlation between the two things would certainly be explained if they just were the same thing, wouldn't it? So the identity theorist says that positing identity explains the correlation of mental with physical properties, or mental states with physical states, however you want to put it. Smart says that sensations, states of consciousness, they do seem to be the one sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. And for various reasons, I just cannot believe that this can be so, that everything should be explicable in terms of physics, except the occurrence of sensations seems to me to be, frankly, unbelievable. Such sensations, Smart says, would be nomological danglers. So what does he mean here by the physicalist picture? Well, here again, as I said a moment ago, as the scientific revolution has advanced, more and more causal laws have been discovered, more and more causal laws that determine the sequences of physical events have been discovered, have been identified. Newton's laws of motion, Newton's universal law of gravitation, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Galileo's law of falling bodies, Boyle's law, here again the law for the inverse relation between pressure and volume in a gas. Think of all of the laws of thermodynamics, laws of hydraulics, laws of optics, all these different specialized regions in physics, thermodynamics, the study of heat, hydraulics, the study of liquids, optics, the study of light. In all these fields, causal laws have been discovered. Think of all the causal laws in statistical mechanics. More and more as science advances, here again, the picture of the universe as a kind of causal web. A number of causal laws govern everything that happens. The universe conceived as a kind of web of causal laws. Eventually we will have discovered them all. Eventually we will have identified them all. And at that point we will have what Smart is calling here a complete physicalist picture. That is to say, in principle, it will be possible to demonstrate how everything is determined. Once you know the initial state of the universe, the initial set of physical facts about the number of bodies and their mass and their position, maybe their velocity, certain other properties like that. Once all that is known, physics will be able to explain, predict everything that will ever happen, because everything that happens will be determined by that total set of causal laws. There won't be anything left outside the physicalist picture, as Smart puts it here. Well, in terms of brain science, we're a long way from identifying causal laws in terms of, let's say, causal laws of neurophysiology. That is to say, causal laws that show that a certain sequence of neuron firings determines a certain mental state. Brain science is a long way from that. The best it's been able to achieve so far is to notice certain, here again, of these correlations. But there haven't been causal laws on a par with the kinds of laws that we associate with other branches of physics for neurophysiology of the brain. And so that's why Smart says sensations do seem to be the one sort of thing left outside the physicalist picture. That is to say, critics of identity theory would say that even if such a completely deterministic picture of the physical universe is eventually filled in, there would still be things about the mind that we don't know. There would still be things about mental states that would be left unexplained. That is what the critic of identity theory would say. Smart, as we've seen, denies that. They seem to be the one thing left outside the physicalist picture, but Smart is saying that there can't be this anomaly. You know, once the physicalist picture is completed, there can't be this anomaly, these nomological danglers. Everything that happens in the universe is governed by the total set of causal laws. So this term, nomological, that means having to do with a law, having to do with laws. Specifically in this context, we mean the kinds of physical laws, the kinds of causal laws that are discovered by the physical sciences. So that is what is meant by nomological here. It comes from the Greek term nomos, which means law. A nomological dangler would be something that here again, after the complete web of causal laws is discovered, the physicalist picture is completed. And we have a total understanding. We've completely identified all of the causal laws that govern everything that ever happens physically, anyway, in the universe. There can't be something dangling outside that web of causal laws. And if mental states were not explicable in terms of physics, Smart is saying, that would be the case. There would be this one big anomaly in the universe, namely mental states. There would be these nomological danglers. Namely, here again, this one phenomenon that is dangling outside the web of causal laws that determine everything else that happens in the universe. Smart just finds that not plausible. That everything should be explicable in terms of physics except the occurrence of sensations seems to me to be frankly unbelievable, Smart says. The possibility that mental states will prove irreducibly psychical, that they will be the one thing left outside of the physicalist picture, ought to be judged implausible on grounds of simplicity. Here again, according to Smart, on grounds of simplicity criterion Occam's razor. It is not plausible that there will be this one big anomaly, according to Smart, that when here again, let's just imagine for a moment that in principle physics could be completed. Let's imagine that physics could in principle come to an end someday. All the causal laws that govern physical events have been discovered. They've all been identified. We have this complete physicalist picture. And maybe even all the special sciences have been reduced to physics. Maybe chemistry and biology have been reduced to physics as well. Everything that happens in the universe is explained in terms of causal laws that can be given in terms of basic physical particles. Let's just imagine that that day comes. Here again, it is not plausible, according to Smart, that there would still be one thing in the universe that is left unexplained, namely mental states. Smart says there would be far too many brute and inexplicable facts. We would have millions of facts about the world that would just have to be accepted. But here again, Smart finds it implausible that there would be this one big anomaly in the universe. And he's right, that would be a big one, wouldn't it? Because how many mental states are there in the universe? How many mental states do you go through how many mental states do you go through in the course of a day? How many mental states does a person go through in the course of her life? And there are some number of billion people in the world, and how many people have there ever been in the world? Billions. So how many mental states have there been? So you see what he's driving at here. There would be millions of facts about the world that would be left unexplained after physics has come to an end. The physical, let's imagine the physical sciences have been completed. All the causal laws that determine physical events have been identified, have been discovered. And yet, there are still millions of facts about the world left unexplained. Smart says that's just not plausible. I said a moment ago that the appeal of identity theory is that, of course, if mental states and brain states just were the same thing, if minds and brains just were the same thing, that would explain the correlation. So it's appealing for that reason that perhaps explains part of the prima facie appeal of just saying that they are the same thing. But, of course, when you start to think about it a little bit critically, of course, it's important to keep in mind that just because two things are correlated, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing. From the fact that two things always go together, it doesn't follow, of course, that they're the same thing. So from the fact that by hypothesis, here again, let's just speak ex hypothesi for a moment. Let's say by hypothesis, let's stipulate that every state that has some mental property has some physical property. That is to say, every mental state has the property of being a certain neurophysical brain state. So pleasure is always correlated with endorphin release, let's say, or depression is always correlated with serotonin deficiency, or thirst is always correlated with the firing of certain neurons in the hypothalamus, or pain is always correlated with the firing of C fibers. Let's just stipulate by hypothesis that every state that has some mental property has some physical property. It wouldn't follow that every mental property is a physical property. Just because two things always go together, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing. Consider every object that has some color has some shape, but it wouldn't follow that colors are shapes. Every object that has some shape has some size, but it doesn't follow that shape and size are the same thing. And I'm sure you can think of other examples. Just because two things always go together, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing. So there's a kind of prima facie, kind of first glance appeal to saying that they just are the same thing. But many theorists of mind have objected that it's not a good inference. If that's all you're going on, then it's not a good inference, just that they're correlated. Smart believes that as a matter of empirical discovery, here again we've seen him allow that at the moment sensations, mental states more generally, have not been, at the moment they seem left outside the physicalist picture. They haven't been reduced to causal laws in neurophysiology. But he believes that as a matter of empirical discovery, as brain science advances, it will prove to be the case that every mental state is a brain state. So Smart says, here again, making the point about identity and reduction, there are not two things, a flash of lightning and an electrical discharge. There is one thing, a flash of lightning, which is described scientifically as an electrical discharge to the earth from a cloud of ionized water molecules. So here again, people had a concept of lightning for a long, long time before they had any concept of electricity. It's part of the advance of science that it was discovered that the one thing can just be reduced to the other. Everything about lightning can be explained in terms of certain properties of electricity. And similarly, Smart believes that the neurophysical explanation for every mental state will eventually be discovered. So again, he believes there isn't anything that is irreducibly, as we saw him say, irreducibly psychical or irreducibly mental. So we've been talking about the kind of thought experiment that Smart favors here, imagining that science has come to an end, science has been completed, and all the causal laws have been identified. Let me suggest a slightly different thought experiment. Suppose that's true, and suppose a neurophysiologist looking at what is going on in a subject's brain says that this subject is not in pain. But suppose the subject says he is in pain. Is that possible? Is that a possibility? If that is a possible state of affairs, identity theory would turn out to be wrong. And it seems like in principle that is possible. Now maybe not. Here again, if identity theory is true, and it just does turn out to be that every mental state is a brain state, and eventually the identity will be carried through by neurophysiology, then I guess that would turn out to be wrong. But consider this thought experiment. Subject says he's in pain. Neurophysiologist of the brain says he's not. Our knowledge of our own mental states is incorrigible. You can't be wrong about the way that the world seems to you. You can be wrong about the way that the world is, can't you? But you can't be wrong that the world seems to you a certain way. You can't be wrong about that. If it seems to you that you are in pain, then you are in pain. You can't be wrong about that, right? Oh, I'm feeling pain, but I'm really not in pain? No, right? It's not possible. So this is one kind of way that skeptics about identity theory have expressed their reservations about it. Knowledge of our own mental states is incorrigible. You can't be wrong about the way that the world seems to you. It seems like, in principle, even if neurophysiology of the brain was completed and all the causal laws of neurophysiology that determine mental states were discovered, it seems like such a case is still possible. Maybe not, but just a thought experiment to kind of stimulate your intuitions on what there might be to say on the other side of what Smart is saying here. It seems like, in principle, that scenario could still arise. And if that scenario could still arise, then that would go to show that mental states are, at least elements of them, are irreducibly psychical, can't be reduced to physical explanations. It's as I said, it's an old idea that human beings are just machines of a certain kind. So Smart is really taking what is an old view in philosophy, the mechanistic view of things. Here again, this has always been kind of appealing to philosophers, especially those who look at the sciences as kind of the paradigm, or attach a lot of prestige to the achievements of science in modern times and think that should be the paradigm for philosophy. Those kinds of philosophers have been tended to be very sympathetic to this kind of mechanistic picture of things. So as I said before, it's an old idea, but it's received an impetus. It's received a push from these relatively recent advances in neurophysiology of the brain and these kinds of systematic correlations that have been discovered in relatively recent times. That has given this kind of mechanistic picture of human beings certainly an added push. And that's why it appeals to thinkers like Smart. But as I said before, it's an old idea. And you know that human beings are nothing more than machines of a certain kind, what we saw Smart call physicochemical machines. Not machines like the engine in your car or something like that. Obviously, what goes on at the level of biochemistry is far more complex, far more intricate. But in principle, everything that happens in the brain explicable in the same model of explanation. You just explain it the same way. Where a neuron will be at a certain time is determined by a certain initial set of facts, set of physical facts about the brain and the kinds of causal laws that neurophysiology of the brain might discover. Still just an extension of the mechanistic picture. And as I said, the mechanistic picture is an old one in Western intellectual life, not just philosophy and science, but just in general. We even saw Descartes kind of worrying about this in the 17th century. If you think back to our readings from Descartes, you'll recall him talking about the possibility that underneath the clothes that he sees moving around, there might just be automata. There might just be robots, or what we might call robots or androids today, a kind of automaton, a kind of mechanical man. Maybe human beings are no different from machines, and as artificial intelligence advances, as AI advances, at some point, very sophisticated AI systems, androids, will be indistinguishable from human beings, because in principle, human beings just are machines of a certain kind. That would be the mechanistic view, and of course, you've probably seen this kind of scenario dramatized. There have been a lot of movies, a lot of novels on this theme in recent years, right? Blade Runner, Westworld, different kinds of scenarios in which this is imagined, right? So it's an old idea in Western life, isn't it, that in Western thought, that maybe we just are machines of a certain kind. So in one way or another, identity theory or materialist theories of mind have been with us for a long time. But I would also observe that skepticism about that broad philosophical picture of things has been with us for just as long. So already in the 17th century, Leibniz, for example, the German philosopher Leibniz, was expressing doubts, was expressing skepticism that everything about what goes on inside you, everything about your internal states, everything that happens psychologically will ever be reduced to just mechanistic explanations. Already Leibniz was expressing his skepticism about that broad philosophical picture of things. He offered this thought experiment. Suppose that there were a machine for producing thoughts. Okay? So let's just say that today science has discovered that that machine is the brain. Okay, so let's go with Leibniz in this thought experiment. He says perception cannot be explained mechanically. That is to say, by shapes and motions, figures and motions. That is to say, if the mechanistic model of explanation is just explaining how one physical part interacts with another physical part, then everything that happens in the mind will eventually be explained that way. So here again, what would be a mechanistic explanation? Maybe something like the way that you explain how in your car up and down motion is turned into rotary motion, right? The up and down motion of the pistons in your engine is converted into the rotary motion of the tires by way of crankshaft and axle, right, and gears. You could, in principle, give a kind of mechanistic explanation of how vertical motion is converted into rotary motion in an automobile, right? That would be kind of a stock example of mechanistic explanation. Leibniz is saying that perception, mental states more generally, what happens in a mind, what happens in terms of our internal states, our psychological states, will never be entirely reduced, will never be explained mechanistically in terms of, here again, shapes and motions, physical parts acting on physical parts, in something like the way that the pistons act on the crankshaft, and the crankshaft, its motion is transmitted to the axle, something like that. Nothing like that will ever be done for the way that the mind works, according to Leibniz. He says, suppose that there were a machine so constructed as to produce thought, feeling, and perception. We could imagine it increased in size while retaining the same proportions, so that one could enter, as one might, a mill. Okay, so a mill is a certain machine for converting the force of the river's current into the rotary motion of a grindstone to grind, here again, wheat into flour, or corn into flour. So let's just take that as the paradigm for mechanistic explanation. Here again, the force of the river, the force of its current, is transmitted into a certain kind of rotary motion by the water wheel and the axle that it connects it to the grindstone. Let's take that as kind of a model of mechanistic explanation. Could that ever be done for the mind? Just the interaction of physical parts of the brain would eventually explain everything about our mental states. Well, Leibniz says, imagine that there were such a machine for producing thoughts. We could imagine it increased in size while retaining the same proportions, so that one could enter, as one might, a mill. On going inside, we should only see the parts impinging upon one another. Okay, but that's not going to tell you what the correlated mental state is. So now let's imagine by analogy that the machine is the brain. Okay, imagine you could increase the brain to the point where you could get inside it and walk around and look at the neurotransmitters, look at all the different neural events, look at all the different neurons moving along their paths. And synapses firing, everything that goes in the brain, you would be able to see it at that microphysical level. Suppose you could do that, or instead of increasing the size of the brain, we could imagine we could shrink ourselves down, and then in like some tiny little science fiction type space capsule type deal, we're driving around inside the brain, something like that. There's a movie devoted to that theme some years back called Fantastic Voyage. There was also an episode of Magic School Bus devoted to the same idea. Imagine that we could do that, shrink ourselves down and go inside the brain and see everything that happens at the level of neurophysiology. See synapses firing, see neurons traveling along their paths and so forth, neurotransmitters at work. Suppose we could see everything that happens in the brain. Would you thereby have any better understanding of a mental state? Leibniz says no, you wouldn't. We should not see anything which would explain a perception. That is to say, you would just be seeing bodies at some level. Now we're down at the level of neurons, synapses, peptides, neurotransmitters, the hardware of the brain, right? You're still just seeing bodies acting on other bodies. You're still just seeing bodies impinging on other bodies. In all of that, would you see anything that would explain a perception, Leibniz asks? Or just more generally, in all of that, would you see anything that explains a mental state? Leibniz thought not. So just as the mechanistic picture of things, according to which eventually human beings and everything that goes on inside them will be explicable, will be such that it can all be explained in mechanistic terms. Just as that view has always been with us, or maybe not always, but for a long time has been with us. Similarly, skepticism about that view has been with us for just as long, for a long, long time.